There's a woman in Columbus, Ohio, who worked as a school librarian for 31 years, never made more than $52,000 a year, and retired last spring with more money sitting in her brokerage account than most orthopedic surgeons will ever save in their entire careers. She never picked a hot stock, she never timed a crash, she couldn't tell you what a candlestick chart is if her life depended on it. And that's exactly the point I want to sit with for a second, because it completely breaks the story we've been told about how people actually get rich in the stock market. My name is Daniel, and I've spent years studying not just what people invest in, but why certain ordinary, unremarkable choices quietly outperform the flashy ones almost every single time. And when you look closely at people like this librarian, you start to notice a pattern. It's never the person chasing the next big stock tip who ends up wealthy. It's almost always someone who found two or three boring funds, set up an automatic system, and then, and this is the part people underestimate, simply forgot about it for 2 decades. Today, I want to walk you through the three funds that show up over and over again in the accounts of ordinary millionaires, and more importantly, the psychology behind why they work when so many flashier strategies fail. Here's what's interesting, though. Before we even get to the funds themselves, we have to talk about why the human brain is basically wired to sabotage this strategy. When you buy a single stock, something in your brain lights up. You feel like a participant. You check the price. You tell your friends. It becomes part of your identity. But an index fund doesn't give you that dopamine hit. Nobody brags at a dinner party about owning a boring basket of 500 companies. And that emotional flatness, weirdly, is the entire secret. Because wealth building isn't an emotional activity. The moment investing starts feeling exciting, you should probably be a little suspicious of what you're actually doing with your money. So let's talk about the first fund. And I want you to think about this one differently than you probably have before. It tracks the S&P 500, 500 of the largest companies in the country. But here's the part almost nobody explains properly. This fund is constantly, quietly firing companies. Think about Blockbuster. In the early 2000s, Blockbuster was a massive, dominant company. If you had bought Blockbuster stock directly because it felt safe and obvious, you would have watched your investment slowly bleed to zero, while Netflix, a company almost nobody respected at the time, eventually took its place in that same index. The fund didn't need you to predict that shift. It happened automatically. Underperforming companies get quietly removed, and the next generation of dominant companies gets added in their place. You're not betting on any single business surviving. You're betting on American capitalism's ability to keep replacing failure with innovation, decade after decade. And historically, that bet has paid off at roughly 10% a year before inflation. Now here's where it gets strange, and this is something most people never notice. That 10% number sounds unimpressive when you say it out loud. 10% doesn't sound like a headline. But money doesn't grow in a straight line. It grows in a curve. And most people dramatically underestimate what that curve actually does over time. If you invested $400 a month starting at age 25, by 65, you'd have contributed roughly $192,000 of your own money. But at that same 10% average, the account could realistically be sitting somewhere north of $2.5 million. The difference between what you put in and what you end up with isn't your effort, it's time being left completely alone to do its work, uninterrupted. The second fund shifts the conversation from growth to something more emotional, income. This one focuses on companies that have paid and steadily increased dividends for at least a decade straight. Companies like Chevron, Coca-Cola, and Procter & Gamble. Now here's the psychological trap most people fall into with dividend investing, and I want you to really hear this part. People assume a high dividend means a great investment. It's actually often the opposite. When a stock's dividend yield looks unusually high, it's frequently because the stock's price has been crashing, and desperate investors chase that number without asking why it got so high in the first place. A shrinking, struggling company can look attractive on paper right before it cuts its dividend entirely. The funds built around dividend growth instead of dividend size are filtering for something completely different. They're filtering for financial discipline, for companies whose profits are healthy enough to keep raising that payment year after year. That distinction, growth over size, is the difference between building a second income stream and quietly buying your way into a value trap. Think about that for a second. We're conditioned our whole lives to chase the bigger number, whether that's a higher salary, a bigger house, or in this case, a fatter dividend check, without ever asking whether that bigger number is actually a warning sign in disguise. Now, since we're talking about the psychology of what actually makes people wealthy versus what just looks impressive, I'd genuinely love to know what you think in the comments. Do you believe most people lose money in the market because of bad information or because of bad emotional habits? I ask because I think the answer says a lot about what actually needs to change first. And if conversations like this are useful to you, this is exactly the kind of thing we dig into every week here, so it might be worth hitting subscribe before we keep going, because the next part is where this gets a little uncomfortable. The third fund is the one that creates the most millionaires and also destroys the most portfolios, sometimes in the very same year. It tracks the 100 largest non-financial companies on the NASDAQ, which in practice means it's heavily weighted toward big technology names. This is where explosive growth lives. Over long stretches, this fund has more than doubled the average annual return of the broader market. But here's the part that separates the people who actually get rich from this fund and the people who get burned by it. It's not the returns that matter most, it's your relationship with the drawdowns. This fund has fallen by more than 70% during major downturns in its history. 70%. Imagine watching $200,000 shrink to $60,000 and having absolutely no idea if it's going to keep falling. Most people don't get wealthy or poor because of what this fund does. They get wealthy or poor because of what they do in that exact moment of panic. This is where it gets strange, because logically, a market crash should feel like an opportunity. You're buying the same companies at a discount. But psychologically, it feels like danger, like the walls are closing in, like every dollar you add is a dollar closer to disappearing completely. That mismatch between what logic tells you and what fear tells you is, in my opinion, the single biggest reason wealth in America is so unevenly distributed among people who technically had access to the exact same investment accounts. And here's the realization I really want to leave you with, because I think it changes how you look at your own financial decisions going forward. We tend to think wealthy investors know something we don't, some secret formula, some insider insight, some perfectly timed entry point. But when you actually study the people who quietly built seven-figure portfolios on ordinary salaries, the pattern isn't intelligence, it's emotional consistency. It's the school librarian who never checked her balance during the 2008 crash because she genuinely didn't think to. It's the boring automatic transfer that happens whether the market is up, down, or sideways, whether it's an election year, a recession, or a boom. The strategy was never complicated. What was rare was the discipline to leave it alone. If this changed the way you're thinking about your own investments, or even just your relationship with money in general, go ahead and subscribe, because we break down exactly this kind of financial psychology every week, the stuff that actually moves the needle, not just the surface-level advice. So here's what I'll leave you with. If you found out today that your portfolio wouldn't move for the next 15 years, no matter what you did, what would you actually do differently starting tomorrow?